Hi everybody, Fran here at New Testament Explained. Make sure as always to subscribe if you haven't already. Today's video is going to look at form criticism. We're going to explore what form criticism is, we're going to look at form criticism in action, and then we're going to apply this topic to what we call an assessment objective 2 question if you are doing Edexcel A-level religious studies. So first of all, we need to look at what is form criticism. Now, it is an approach to studying the New Testament, which means it comes under the broader umbrella term of biblical criticism, which I've done an entire video on. So again, if you are not familiar with that term, please watch that. Form criticism is considered as having two main aims. The first is to classify individual units of writing, which we call pericopes, into different literary forms or genres. And then the second aim is to consider how these units have been adapted since its original oral transmission in order to fit the needs of the early church. So, upon hearing the story, how did the gospel writers amend or adapt the account that is written down in order to meet the demands of the early church? In order to do this, form critics need to link these individual units of writing to what's called a Sitz im Leben, which means its setting. Therefore, in total, looking a bit more holistically, what form critics are trying to look at is how individual units of writing have been adapted to meet the needs of the early church. And if you've been watching some of my other videos, for example, the one on source criticism, if you take the analogy of a pearl necklace again, a form critic would analyse which each individual pearl is like. On to form criticism in action then. I'm going to look at two examples, but do remember there are many more that you could use. So the first one I'm going to look at is the theory proposed by Martin de Bilius, and he identified literary categories that he argues were used as building blocks in the Gospels. And you'll see the list on this slide, got legends, myths, etc. And what he from there says is that there are two main literary areas in the Gospels. The sayings of Jesus, and there's two Bible quotes you can use there as examples in essays, and then you've got stories about Jesus, and again a couple of Bible quotes and Bible extracts that you can use to support that argument. The second one is actually one that's more familiar to us. If you are studying New Testament studies, you may not have looked at Bultmann yet. It does technically come later on in the course, but you will study him as part of the Edexcel A-level religious studies. He is a form critic, and we've got this quote that he says, so the aim of form criticism is to determine the original form of a piece of narrative. In the process, we learn to distinguish secondary additions and forms, and these in turn lead to an important result for the history of the tradition. And in terms of the theory we look at, he does have quite a few theories that come under the topic of form criticism, but the one that we study, so I'm going to focus on that, is his argument that we need to demythologize units of New Testament texts in order for us to understand the meaning behind the myths that were used in the New Testament, because in the first century people lived in a mythological worldview, whereas today we live in a scientific one. In terms of Bultmann, I've not made it just yet, but hopefully at some point you will glance across this YouTube channel and you will find a video on Bultmann, so keep an eye out for that if you want more detail on his theory that again links to form criticism. If you're studying Edexcel A-level religious studies, you could be asked an assessed question on form criticism and if it is significant for understanding the New Testament texts. Now, as always, the arguments and counter-arguments are linked together. So in terms of the second row then, the argument is looking at how form criticism helps us understand the early church and how Bible passages can be altered as a result of needing to meet the needs of the early church. And an interesting study by Jeremias in 1966 explored how the parables changed in terms of what was written about them to meet the needs of the early church, and how actually what Jesus said would have been slightly different. The counter argument is form criticism starts to raise questions about how much we can learn about the historical Jesus if so much of these gospels have been altered to meet the needs of the early church. So kind of here you've got a question of, is it more important to know about the early church and their needs and their demands, or is it more important to know about Jesus and the historical Jesus in particular? The final row looks at how form criticism helps us understand the importance the author placed on certain teachings or events, and it does also pave the way for redaction criticism, which is going to be a separate video, so keep an eye out for that, please. The counter argument to those kind of collective points is that the fundamental issue almost with form criticism is that it works on a bit of an assumption that the gospel writers wrote individual units in isolation to meet the needs of the early church, and what form criticism fails to do is to bring these units together to understand what the gospel writer was trying to get across his entire gospel. So it kind of breaks up the unity of the gospels and the sort of big picture points that the gospel writers may have been trying to get across. So again, here you not only need to be confident with the points, and I would recommend going and researching some of these scholars in particular in more detail, but you need to be aware of how the arguments and counter arguments relate to each other and which side you are more convinced by. That then is the end of my short video on form criticism. It should give you an introduction to what form criticism is, what it looks like in action, and how you would answer an assess question if you are studying Edexcel A-level religious studies. Thank you for watching. Make sure you also watch the videos on source criticism and redaction criticism, and most importantly, make sure to subscribe. Thank you.